The sea was rough long before the first American soldier saw the coast of France. In the dark hours before dawn on June 6, 1944, thousands of men sat packed inside landing craft that slammed against the waves like loose metal boxes. Diesel fumes hung in the air. Some soldiers were silent, staring down at their boots. Others tried to joke, but the humor sounded hollow. Most of them had never been in combat before. They were farmers, factory workers, mechanics, clerks. A few months earlier, many of them had still been living ordinary lives in towns scattered across the United States. Now they were heading toward the most heavily defended coastline in Europe. Somewhere far ahead, beyond the black horizon, the coast of Normandy waited behind concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and miles of obstacles planted in the sand. German soldiers had spent years preparing that coastline for exactly this moment. Every approach to the beach had been mapped. Every stretch of water had been measured. Machine guns were positioned so that their fields of fire overlapped perfectly. Mortars were already registered on the sand below. The men in the landing craft knew very little about those details. What they had been told was simple. Naval guns and bombers would smash the German defenses before they arrived. Tanks would land with them. Within a few hours, they would be moving inland. It sounded orderly on a map. War rarely follows maps. As the invasion fleet approached the French coast, the sky slowly began to turn gray. The horizon appeared first as a faint line, then as darker shapes rising from the water. The soldiers began to see the bluffs above the beaches. Somewhere up there, hidden behind concrete and steel, German gunners were already watching the sea. The first bombardment had already happened hours earlier. Hundreds of aircraft had crossed the coast during the night, dropping bombs toward the German defenses. But heavy cloud cover and fear of hitting Allied ships caused many bombardiers to release their bombs too late. The explosions landed far inland instead of on the bunkers. From the German perspective inside those bunkers, the night had been loud but strangely harmless. Many of the defenses overlooking the beaches remained untouched. When the first wave of landing craft approached the shore, the men inside could finally see the coastline clearly. Rows of steel obstacles stuck out of the surf like rusted teeth. Wooden stakes pointed toward the sky. Mines were attached to many of them, positioned so that landing craft would detonate the moment they struck. Then the ramps dropped. Machine gun fire erupted almost instantly. The soldiers who jumped first landed in water deeper than expected. Some vanished beneath the waves under the weight of their equipment. Others struggled forward, bullets snapping across the surface of the water around them. The noise was overwhelming. Artillery shells burst in the surf. Mortars rained down from the bluffs. Within minutes, the carefully organized assault formations dissolved into scattered groups of men trying simply to stay alive. Many soldiers never made it beyond the waterline. The beach quickly filled with wounded men calling for medics. Others crawled behind obstacles for cover. Landing craft burned in the shallows. Radios were destroyed. Officers disappeared in the chaos. Some units lost nearly all of their leaders in the first moments. From the ships offshore, officers watching through binoculars saw a scene that looked like catastrophe. The neat waves of the invasion plan were breaking apart before they even reached the sand. In those first terrible minutes, it appeared the invasion might fail right there on the beach. Among the later waves approaching the shore was a tall officer who had spent years studying amphibious warfare. He had helped plan landings long before anyone knew exactly where the invasion of Europe would occur. He understood better than most how fragile the plan actually was. His name was Brigadier General Norman Cota. When his landing craft finally reached the beach, the situation in front of him looked exactly like the disaster he had feared during planning meetings months earlier. The bombardment had not destroyed the bunkers. The defenses were still firing. Men were pinned flat against the sand, unable to move. Coda stepped into the water and waded toward the shore as bullets cut across the beach. Around him, wounded soldiers crawled toward any scrap of cover they could find. Smoke drifted across the sand. The entire shoreline had become a killing ground. Most officers in that situation would have stayed low, crawling or running between cover. Coda did something different. He stood up. Then he began walking across the beach. Men who had been lying flat in the sand looked up in disbelief as the general moved from group to group through machine gun fire. He shouted at soldiers to get moving. He kicked at men who were frozen with fear and pointed them toward the bluffs above the beach. Staying on the sand meant death. The only chance was to move forward. At one point, he encountered a group of rangers pinned behind cover. When he asked who they were and heard the answer, his reply became one of the most famous lines in American military history. "Well then," he shouted, "Rangers, lead the way." Nearby engineers began blowing gaps in the barbed wire with explosive charges. Small groups of soldiers started climbing the slopes toward the German positions above. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when the battle suddenly turned. Instead, it happened slowly, in scattered places along the beach. A lieutenant gathered a handful of survivors and pushed toward a narrow draw between the cliffs. A sergeant led men through a gap in the obstacles. A medic crawled from wounded soldier to wounded soldier under constant fire. Everywhere along the shoreline, small groups began doing the same thing. They moved forward because remaining still meant certain death. Out at sea, officers aboard destroyers could see the struggle unfolding through their binoculars. The men on the beach needed help immediately, and the naval commanders knew it. Standard naval doctrine required ships to remain well offshore during bombardment. But some destroyer captains decided doctrine did not matter anymore. They pushed their ships closer to land, closer, and closer still. Soon, several destroyers were operating only a few hundred yards from the beach. At that distance, the sailors could see the flashes of German guns on the bluffs. Their own guns fired directly into the bunkers, smashing positions that had survived the earlier bombardment. One ship fired so many shells at a cliffside gun position that the rock beneath it collapsed. For the soldiers pinned on the sand, the sudden roar of naval guns overhead brought relief they had not expected to survive long enough to see. The German defenses that had dominated the beach for hours began to fall silent one by one. By late morning, the fight had changed completely. Instead of a trapped force struggling to survive on the shoreline, small groups of American soldiers were fighting their way through the German defenses above the beach. It was still chaotic. Units were mixed together. Officers often commanded soldiers they had never met before. Maps were useless. Orders traveled by word of mouth. But the Americans were no longer stuck on the sand. They were moving inland. German commanders watching the battle unfold began reporting something unusual. The attackers had taken terrible casualties, yet they kept advancing. When one group was stopped, another appeared somewhere else. From the German perspective, the assault looked almost irrational. But it never stopped. By late afternoon, the beachhead existed. It was small. It was fragile. But it was real. For the Allied commanders watching from ships offshore and headquarters in England, the realization slowly set in that the invasion had survived its most dangerous moment. The soldiers on the beach had done it themselves. News of the fighting spread quickly through Allied command circles. British officers who had long questioned whether inexperienced American troops could withstand the German army were forced to reconsider what they had just witnessed. The American assault had nearly collapsed, yet it had recovered in the middle of chaos. Not through careful planning, but through stubborn determination. By nightfall, thousands of soldiers were moving inland from the beaches of Normandy. Supplies and reinforcements continued arriving. Engineers cleared obstacles. Medics worked through the night treating wounded men who had survived the morning. The invasion of Western Europe had begun. But victory had come at a terrible cost. Across the beaches and fields of Normandy, thousands of soldiers lay where they had fallen. Many would never return home. Years later, visitors standing on the quiet bluffs above Omaha Beach often find it difficult to imagine the violence that once filled that coastline. The water moves gently against the sand. The fields beyond the beach are green and peaceful. Yet beneath that calm landscape lies one of the most decisive moments of the war. Because if the soldiers on that beach had failed, if they had remained pinned in the sand, the entire invasion might have collapsed. Instead, scattered groups of ordinary men made a decision over and over again throughout that morning. They stood up, they moved forward, and in doing so, they changed the course of the war.